Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohlenbacher.
And today we've got a pretty heavy topic. We're going to be talking about plagues and why God would allow them.
That's right. It's going to be a lot to digest with that. We're going to be looking at kind of the historical evidence for plagues, along with talking about just that general thought process of how do we work through this issue.
Right. Like a skeptic would say, well, if God's loving, why would he allow plagues? We want to be able to address those questions.
Well, we hope that we equip you to handle these subjects, so let's go ahead and jump right into what we're covering today. In Everyday Apologetics, we're going to hear from molecular biologist A.J. Roberts on why would God allow suffering.
And in Science Faith Connection, Jeff Swearing will be interviewing astrophysicist Hugh Ross on if there's scientific evidence for biblical plagues.
First up, we have Culture Talk. Sandra and philosopher theologian Ken Samples will kick things off with why would a loving God allow plagues? Let's check it out.
Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Sandra.
We're going to be talking about a very light subject. Just kidding. We're going to be talking about why God would allow plagues. So we know the Bible tells of plagues that befell certain populations, everything from locusts and boils and the killing of the firstborn sons. A skeptic would rightly ask, if God is all loving, why would he allow plagues to befall humanity?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, to be perfectly candid. I think when you look at the context, the Israelites have been taken captive by the Egyptians, so the Jewish people are enslaved. Through his prophet, Yahweh tells Moses to go to the Pharaoh, let my people go. He refuses. The Pharaoh is seen as a living God. So I think the way to understand the plagues and that the series of judgments that befall the Egyptians is that God is sending a message to not just the Egyptian people and the Pharaoh, but he's sending a message even to the broader pagan deities that I'm the true and living God. And it's expressing his disfavor and his judgment. And I think to remember the plan is to take the Jews out of bondage, to give them the law. So these are really the important points of the Old Testament, the Exodus, the giving of the law. And then long term, a Messiah is going to come out of those Jewish people.
So for today's reader, as we're looking at these plagues, what is it that we are to glean as far as the purpose, God's purpose in these plagues and why it relates to us today?
Yeah, I think there's a line in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where it's said of Aslan, he's good, but he's not safe. God is perfectly loving. God is omnibenevolent. I like to say he's unsurpassingly good. But with goodness and love is justice. And so this is a sign that God will punish rebellion. And I think that's something to keep in mind. I mean, what is it that rescues us from the just wrath of God? It's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So it takes a lot to save us. And therefore, I don't think we should minimize the wrath of God. But God's not loving if he's not just. And he's not just if he's not also loving and good. So I think we need to see that in its broadest context.
Right. I think I like what you said there, that God isn't just if he isn't loving, and he isn't loving if he isn't just. And we think of justice systems and what that might look like as a loving expression. Of course, now as people, we corrupt it. So a skeptic might wonder, when you're talking about God's wrath, I think it might be hard to wrap one's head around the idea that God would get angry. A loving God would get angry and have wrath and have judgment. So how can you engage in a conversation when someone asks that question, not to poke and prod, but really out of a genuine curiosity?
Well, I think one angle that needs to be looked at very carefully is the language about God that we receive is really oftentimes anthropomorphic. So when it talks about God being wrathful or God being emotional or I'm a jealous God, I think we have to recognize that God is an infinite, eternal, personal, divine individual. And with the Trinity, one God in three persons. So I don't think we want to think of that as, well, God's throwing a fit. And he's just expressing anger in a reckless type of way. I think we want to understand that to sin against God, it isn't so much the particular sin or even how long you sin. I mean, sometimes people say, I don't get the calculus of the Bible. I sin for 70 years, I get punished for eternity. How's that work? I would say, remember who you're sinning against. You're sinning against the Lord God Almighty. You're sinning against the God who brought all things into existence. You're sinning against a God that's perfectly loving, perfectly holy, perfectly just. I think there is an awe-inspiring element in all of that. So I wouldn't want people to think of it as God's reacting emotionally.
Right, like throwing a tantrum almost.
There you go. That's the right word.
Well, I think that might help in a conversation with someone who's genuinely curious, but surely they're going to want to know more. So what are some points that you would recommend to Christians who are going to engage in these sorts of conversations from a skeptic who's wondering about plagues and about an angry God? Like, what are some main takeaways that you would encourage them to press into?
Yeah, I think I would draw people to this, Sandra, that Christians worship God, and we worship God because he has all of these perfections. He is a being that is completely maximally good. God is perfectly holy, perfectly loving. God has all these qualities of infinity. And I think that's the reason that we reasonably worship the Lord God. And again, I think I'd want to bring people back to the idea that Aslan's good, but he's not safe. There is a sense about God that he's different than mere human beings.
Right. Well, and I think for those who aren't familiar, that Aslan is a Christ-like character in the Chronicles of Narnia that C.S. Lewis wrote. Right. I think that's an important, really, analogy that C.S. Lewis uses in talking about Christ and his character. Right. Thank you so much for that, Ken. If you would like to hear more from Ken Samples, go to reasons.org and search for his blog, Reflections.
But what about other natural disasters like earthquakes? Well, although one of the most persistent and deadliest forms of natural disasters throughout history, earthquakes need not be so destructive. They need not kill or injure so many people. It is primarily our failure to act with compassion and integrity on the knowledge that we have that causes so much pain and human suffering in the face of these earth-shaking disasters. I expound on these points as well in another talk available to you online at RTB's YouTube channel. But suffice it to say that with earthquakes, we often rush to judgment again, claiming that something that is actually vitally good and necessary for human flourishing is bad or evil. Hugh comments on this in one of his blogs, where he says if we were to imagine an Earth without plate tectonics, we might envision less natural disasters. Fewer tsunamis, fewer earthquakes, fewer volcanic eruptions. Sounds nice, but it would be far more accurate to envision a planet hostile and barren to life, like Mars or Venus. Because Earth's planet-shifting plates provide life-critical effects on a planetary scale. Things such as global thermal regulation, things that help control the carbon dioxide level in our atmosphere that helps protect us from the sun's increasing luminosity. So we definitely misunderstand what's going on around us if we think earthquakes, bacteria, and viruses are primarily bad. The more we learn about them through scientific inquiries, the more we discover they're not only good, they are vitally important for human flourishing. So as we understand that things that we superficially judge as bad or evil are awfully are actually extremely good and critical for life on earth, we see that God's revelation in creation reinforces the Christian view of God as rich in love and in provision. And we now have an answer to some critics' quips as to why a good and powerful God might permit evil in nature. And this gives us confidence that his love and his heart for us is true and great and good, as we see these demonstrations in nature are actually for our human flourishing. And as we grow in confidence in God and God's word, I think it will help us to consider that as we turn now to examples of other forms of evil and suffering. And I hope I've given you something to consider that begins to challenge you to belief revision about natural evil. Now, I've not addressed the problem of moral evil, and given more time, I could actually comment on how moral evil exacerbates the effects of natural disasters. It causes more pain and suffering and more loss of human life. Things like poor construction, building in floodplains, a failure to manage environmental risks, failures to address malnutrition and drought, and misuse of antibiotics. But before we move on, I want to encourage you that whenever you're in a conversation, including the conversation we're having today, me from the stage, that we take on huge risks in addressing the problem of evil and pain and suffering. And whether it results from moral evil, individual choices, or acts of nature, I don't want to gloss over the very real pain that many of us experience on a personal level, and many of us observe in the people that we care about and love around us. You know, I have friends and family who suffer from chronic pain, who are battling cancer, who struggle with lifelong mental illness, or who are facing mental deterioration at life's end. So I don't want to gloss over that, but in the next part of the talk, I really want to begin to address the way that we think about suffering and pain. I want to try to offer us encouragement and possibly help us to think about suffering in a way that may help alleviate some of the unmanageable pain that we experience. And may I suggest that we might even benefit from more belief revision in regard to suffering itself. So how can we begin to think about suffering in light of a Christian worldview, a Christ-centered or Christ-informed view of life? Well, I think contemporary theologian N.T. Wright, in a response to suffering, sums it up best. He says the way of Christian witness is not the way of quietist withdrawal. It is not the way of militant zeal. It is the way of being in Christ in the Spirit at the place where the world is in pain, so that the healing love of God may be brought to bear at that point. It's actually very important, I think, to be in prayer at the place where the world is in pain. It's part of our Christian vocation. Now, N.T. Wright's words capture one of the greatest truths of Christianity. We are not meant to go it alone. God does not leave us alone in our suffering. Jesus became a man, and he experienced deepest suffering himself. And Jesus promises to never leave us, even in our darkest valleys. And we are adopted into Christian community when we become part of God's family through faith. And we are called to comfort one another with the comfort that we've received from God and with the comfort of God's promises, that God will be present with us, that he will bring justice and ultimately deliverance.
Hello, Jeff Zwarenk. Welcome back to Science Faith Connection, a segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and see how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by Dr. Hugh Ross, and we're going to be discussing the scientific evidence for the plagues of the Exodus. Hugh, it's good to have you here today.
Well, thank you.
So, I mean, you look at Exodus, and it just seems kind of incredible. I mean, you've got gnats, and you've got the Nile turning to blood, and all sorts of things. A lot of people look at that and say, well, this is just a story. It's not really what happened. Is there evidence that the plagues of the Exodus actually happened?
There's no historical record, but we wouldn't expect there to be a historical record because the Egyptians had the common practice of only recording their victories and their successes. So this is in the category of a failure, a disaster. So they're not going to record it.
So in terms of the Egyptians recording it, we wouldn't expect to see that.
We wouldn't expect the Egyptians to record it, correct?
Is there anything of, like geological, archaeological history that you would expect to find a record of what's going on? Or, I mean, would you expect to be able to look and find, oh, here's the evidence that this happened in some sort of physical way?
Well, notice that most of the plagues are biological in nature. So yeah, you're not going to find any evidence, 3,500 years after the fact.
So if that's the case, why would we have any reason to think this actually happened?
Well, something had to explain the collapse of the Egyptian empire. I mean, getting 3.5 million people leaving the country, heading to the land of Canaan. And notice in the book of Exodus, it says, many Egyptians joined them. Moreover, we see the Egyptians pouring their wealth upon these Israelites and the Egyptians that were going with them. And so the nation got impoverished. These disasters would have had a major economic effect on it. And so you have this vast empire that went down to southern Sudan and Kenya and spilled over into Mesopotamia, and overnight it's a shadow of its former self. Something had to happen to explain that dramatic collapse.
Well, that's kind of interesting because, when you look at the biblical account, it's talking about what God is doing in preparation for his people and leading them out, but it really doesn't say much about the nation of Israel, or the nation of Egypt afterwards. So you're arguing that this is a good explanation for, we've got this record of Egypt being a very powerful nation, and then just kind of in a relatively quick moment of time becomes a non-world power at all.
True, and look at the people resources they're losing, because the people that went with the Israelites are those that say, hey, God's with them, it's not with our Pharaoh, we're going with them. And I imagine it was some of the better educated and more talented Egyptians that joined the Israelites and said, we're going with you to the land of Canaan.
So let's take a step back. I know there's at least one article on our website by Hugh Henry and Dan Dyke who offer a plausible explanation, and they make very clear that this isn't like, oh, we're explaining the plagues of the Exodus. But they offer an explanation that for the first plague, where it's the river Nile that is turning red, that there's a red toxic algae bloom, which leads to a bunch of frogs being a frog explosion, which as the frogs are decaying, you get gnats. It's kind of this chain of events where it makes a plausible, hey, we could actually explain this. What do you think of explanations like that? Good, bad, or something else?
Well, I think they're good, but they're still supernatural because look at the timing. There's a sequence, and I looked at the one about the plague of darkness that encompassed the land. Mm-hmm. Well, growing up in coastal British Columbia, I remember some times where it was virtually black during the middle of the day, but you don't get weather systems like that in Egypt. Mm-hmm. So something, God had to step in and bring about this never before seen meteorological event into a desert region. And so it's like, hey, this is supernatural control of meteorology. It's not just a natural occurrence by chance.
So that's an interesting point, because if I get what you're saying, there may be things that we would label as miraculous that we can actually find a physical explanation for. Many would say, and my position on this, but many would say, well, if you found a natural explanation, then therefore God's not involved or it's not miraculous. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think one of the most best responses is, where the Red Sea is parted, and there's been a number of explanations about how you can get wind phenomena in a desert region like that, where that will happen. But notice, we got the Israelites and their Egyptian compatriots going across the Red Sea on dry land. The Egyptian army follows them, and what happens to the Egyptian army? So it's the perfect timing. Mm-hmm. The Israelites and their Egyptian compatriots walked across safely without any mud issues. As soon as the Egyptian army came in, everything collapsed and they were wiped out. So someone's controlling a clock.
Yeah, that just, it's a different perspective on it, that the miraculous is not in whether we can explain it or not, but it's in, almost like God setting it up. The one of the comments that Dan Dyke and Hugh Henry make in their article, it's like, where the Nile turns red, that's like, okay, there's something, God's preparing Moses, saying that's going to happen. He knows this other thing's going to happen. God tells him, hey, this is what's going to happen. It's not that it's unexplainable. It's that God knows the timing, and it's beyond what the Egyptians and
moreover, you got Moses predicting it ahead of time.
Exactly. Yes.
And it catches the Egyptians by surprise. It's not like, oh well, yeah, we can see this red tide developing already. They're caught by surprise at every single one of those 10 plagues. And notice those 10 plagues happen relatively soon after one another. So it'd be one thing to say, well, maybe we can explain this plague of gnats, but the fact that it's quickly followed up by all these other plagues, all with perfect timing, right after Moses says, this is going to happen.
So would it be a reasonable explanation to say these are just kind of natural occurrences that God's orchestrated, obviously? He knows the weather patterns, he knows all of that's going to happen, but it's just kind of a sequence of events that's going to play out? Or is there something more to that where God is directly intervening to make things happen?
Well, the analogy, I call these things transformational miracles in the sense that the laws of physics aren't being violated, but it'd be like, okay, a tornado goes through a junkyard and you get an airplane out of it that you can fly, as opposed to you and a bunch of your engineering and scientist friends going to different manufacturing companies, buying the parts and pulling it all together. Somebody with a lot of intellect and knowledge and control over all these things. It wasn't just you going to a mine and getting iron ore. You actually got the stuff that was prefabricated and ready to go to put together. So as a manufacturer here, without an intelligent, mindful manufacturer, you're not going to get those events.
So even if we can explain maybe what caused the events, or in retrospect say, these are the natural phenomena behind it, the fact that they're orchestrated in the thing and that they accomplish a purpose of what they're going, because it does seem like, I don't know whether it's just 10's a random number or whatever, but these plagues seem to have a function more than just, here's a bunch of devastating stuff. What would you say is going on with the plagues?
Especially when you get to the later plagues, because when you get to that last one, the firstborn of every one of your families and of your animals. And so the secondborn, the thirdborn, the fourthborn, they're all fine. It's the firstborn. So how do you explain where you're only getting the firstborn knocked out and nobody else? Everybody else is healthy. And the fact that the firstborn of the Israelites and their Egyptian compatriots, again, they're fine. So it's the selectivity that tells me this is a miracle.
So one last question. You mentioned that there's a lot of Egyptians that seem to be following the Israelites as this happens. Is that just simply because we're going to pick the winner and go with it? Or is there something about the way the plagues comes out that seems to be influencing that?
Well, notice at the beginning we have Moses doing his thing, and the Egyptian magicians say, well, we can do that too. The whole thing about the staffs and the snakes. And but then as we move into the plagues, they say, we can't do that. And so this is telling the Egyptians, it's their God. Our gods are not able to do this. Their God can do this. And God is with them. I want to be with them. And they got righteous laws. I want to be with them. And they could see the insanity of Pharaoh's response and saying, I don't think I want that man as a leader. I'm going to go with Moses.
Well, thanks, Hugh. I really appreciate your comments. When we look at the plagues of the Exodus, it kind of seems almost brutal in some sense. But yet, when we examine it a little more closely, what we see is that God is using the miracles of the plagues of Exodus to witness actually not only to the Israelites, but also to the Egyptians and to bring people into his kingdom. Very similar to Jesus' authority as God being authenticated by his miracles. I would encourage you to check down in the show notes. There's some articles that you can go to investigate more. What might be some of the plausible explanations for the plagues? What's going on? To help you be more equipped to answer the challenges that people raise against why would God use all the plagues and what's he doing so that you can be equipped to share the gospel.
That does it for us this week on 2019. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that it helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
Yeah, you know what? I really appreciated what Ken had to say in our segment, just talking about plagues and the purpose of them, but also just talking about the difference between being just and loving, and that you really can't have one without the other.
Yeah, it's definitely awesome. I think that really goes back to just what we stand for here at Reasons to Believe.
Right.
And I really enjoyed the conversation that Jeff had with Hugh, kind of regarding just like looking at, the evidence for it, because people will bring it up. Was there evidence for the plagues of the Old Testament? And Well, you can't look at the exact evidence because they're biological and that doesn't last, but looking at some of the other factors that we can talk about, and there is some critical thinking in that. We're not just kind of making up stories or fantasies. So very interesting topics overall.
Yeah, definitely. And there's plenty more to unpack, so you can always go to reasons.org and search for plagues to dig deeper into those topics. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show and search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
And if you want the audio version of our show, we are on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
See you next week.
Bye.